Have you ever, really tried to picture where your thoughts come from? Where in your physical self your mind actually exists?
Like a specific spot, you mean?
Yeah, it's a question that's kind of fit for, well, a king who's also a philosopher, isn't it? It's this huge mystery that people have been trying to figure out forever.
Definitely. And one of the most interesting attempts to solve this riddle came from Rene Descartes.
Oh, yeah, Descartes, he's like a giant in philosophy.
And he was super interested in a teeny tiny part of the brain called the pineal gland.
And our listener today, you were the one who wanted to know more about this, right? Well, think of us as your royal advisors, guiding you through all these old documents in philosophy, kind of like we're exploring a hidden library full of ancient scrolls.
Exactly. And what we're really aiming for today is trying to understand why Descartes thought this little pineal gland, it's shaped like a pine nut, was the principal seat of the soul, the place where all our thoughts are formed.
Like, whoa, that's a big claim.
Big claim, yeah. And we'll be diving into his reasoning, the scientific knowledge back then, and how people reacted to his ideas and kind of built on them later. Get ready for some twists and turns, though. This is going to be a fun ride through intellectual history.
Okay, so to really get this, we got to go way back, right, like back to Galen in the 2nd century.
Right. Galen. He was a huge deal in medicine. Like, his ideas were super influential for over 1,000 years.
So what did this early explorer of the body think about the pineal gland?
Well, he saw it and thought, that looks like a pine nut. So he gave it the name we still use today, pineal gland, or glandular pinealis, from the Greek Canarian. He thought it was just a regular gland, like helping out the blood vessels.
So just a normal physical thing, no deeper meaning.
Well, not quite. Galen actually went out of his way to argue against the idea, popular at the time, that the pineal gland controlled the flow of what they called psychic pneuma between the middle and posterior ventricles of the brain.
Wait, hold on, psychic pneuma, what's that?
It was basically what he considered the first instrument of the soul, this kind of vital spirit they believed was behind all mental activity.
So even back then, people were already connecting this gland to the mind. Why was Galen against it?
He had a couple of reasons. He saw that the pineal gland is attached to the outside of the brain, which is true, and he didn't think it could move on its own. He thought the worm-like appendage of the cerebellum, we call it the vermis superior cerebelli now, that was more likely to be controlling this flow of vital spirits.
Worm-like appendage, huh? That's a vivid image.
Yeah, and they had different names for the ventricles, the fluid-filled spaces in the brain. We call the lateral ventricles, they call the anterior. The third ventricle was the middle, and the fourth was the posterior. It was a total different map of the brain back then.
Okay, so different map, different ideas. Did these ventricle theories, about them being linked to mental abilities, did they stick around?
Absolutely. In late antiquity, they developed into what we call ventricular localization theories. The big idea here is that they thought the ventricles themselves, these spaces with fluid, were the key to how the mind worked. So they tried to assign different mental abilities to specific ventricles, like mapping a new territory.
So like saying, this ventricle does imagination, that one does reasoning.
Exactly. Posidonius, for example, said the forepart, middle ventricle, and hind part of the brain were for imagination, reason, and memory.
Wow, so they were already trying to find the control center for each mental ability, right?
Yeah, like trying to map out a palace of the mind within the brain. And Nemesius went further, assigning imagination to the anterior ventricle, reason to the middle, and memory to the posterior.
Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here. And did this idea last?
Oh, yeah. It was hugely influential for centuries, up until the mid-16th century. Even Avicenna in the Middle Ages adapted it, connecting Aristotle's ideas about the soul to this ventricle system. Aristotle's On the Soul, where he talks about different parts of the soul, medieval thinkers were trying to give them physical locations in the brain.
It's like they were building a map of the mind, room by room, in those fluid-filled spaces. So where does the pineal gland fit back into all this?
Well, things get interesting in the Middle Ages. Costa ibn Lucca, in his book on the difference between spirit and soul, he combined Nemesius's ventricle localization with Galen's idea about a worm-like part-controlling spirit flow. He even said that looking up or down could physically move this worm to help you remember things or think.
Whoa, so he literally thought your head movements were controlling your thoughts.
Pretty much.
Mm.
And here's where it gets tricky for the pineal gland. Later on, in medieval texts, they started using the word pinea, which means pineal gland, to refer to this worm-like obstacle.
So they were basically saying the pineal gland did control the flow of spirits, which Galen was so against.
Exactly. It was a total reversal of his ideas.
Talk about a plot twist. But it sounds like there was a lot of confusion about what they were actually talking about.
Oh, for sure. They didn't seem to know the difference between the pineal gland and the vermis of the cerebellum.
Yeah.
And then Mondino de Luzzi came along and said the choroid plexus, which is in the lateral ventricles, that was a worm controlling the flow between ventricles.
So now they have three different things all called worm. What a mess.
A total anatomical identity crisis.
Hmm.
But then came the Renaissance, and things started to get clearer. Niccolò Massa figured out that the ventricles weren't filled with air or spirits, but with fluid, what we call cerebrospinal fluid. That blew apart all those old theories about how the brain worked.
Yeah, I bet that caused quite a stir.
It did. And Andreas Vesalius, a giant in Renaissance anatomy, he went even further and completely rejected all those ventricular localization theories and the idea that the choroid plexus, pineal gland, or vermis had anything to do with controlling spirit flow.
So they finally got rid of the worm theories.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And these Renaissance discoveries gave a much more accurate picture of the brain. This is the backdrop for Descartes. He's building on this new understanding as he develops his own theories.
Okay, so we've got the stage set, the historical background. Time to bring in Descartes, the star of the show. Now, he was more than just a philosopher, right? He was really into understanding the body.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
He was fascinated by how things worked. Some people even think that if he were alive today, he'd be all over those fancy brain imaging technologies, MRIs and all that.
Yeah, I can see him geeking out over those. So let's start with his early book, The Treatise of Man. What was he trying to do there?
In the treatise, he wasn't describing real humans. He was building a hypothetical model of a mechanical man created by God, a being made of both body and soul. But the book mostly focuses on the body, trying to explain how it worked like a complex machine, things like digestion, heartbeats, senses, imagination, memory, even movement. And he did all this without needing a vegetative or sensitive soul, the parts traditionally thought to be in non-rational beings.
So like a robot, but designed by God, where did the pineal gland fit into all this mechanics?
It was crucial for him, especially for explaining how this mechanical man could have sensations, imagination, memory, and how it could initiate movement. But, looking back now, we can see that some of his ideas about the brain's anatomy were, well, a bit off.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, first, he thought the pineal gland was hanging right in the middle of the ventricles, like a pendulum. Second, he thought it was filled with animal spirits. Now, back then, people believed there was this subtle, fluid animal spirits flowing through the nerves and brain, controlling sensation and movement. But Descartes got it wrong about how these spirits got into the pineal gland. He thought they came through arteries when it's actually veins around it. And third, he described these spirits as very fine wind or lively flame that inflated the ventricles. But we know now, and actually Niccolò Massa knew 100 years before Descartes wrote the treatise, that the ventricles are filled with cerebrospinal fluid, not some kind of air or fire.
So basically the foundation of his theory was built on some shaky ground. Did that affect how he explained the pineal gland's role in this mechanical man?
Yeah, for sure. His focus was on the pattern of how these animal spirits flowed around the pineal gland. So, for perception, he imagined nerves as hollow tubes with tiny fibers connected to valves in the ventricles. When you sense something, like touching a hot object, those fibers get pulled, the valves open, and animal spirits rush out, creating a kind of low-pressure image on the pineal gland. And Descartes believed this is what causes sensory perception. He even called these impressions on the gland ideas, but in a purely physical sense.
So it's all about mechanics, cause and effect. What about imagination and memory in this mechanical being?
Well, he saw imagination as similar to perception, but triggered internally, maybe by leftovers from a previous sensation. This would still create impressions on the pineal gland, which he labeled gland H in his diagrams. And for memory, he thought the flow of animal spirits would widen tiny pores in the brain, creating pathways. Later, when the spirits flowed again, they'd follow those same paths, recreating the ideas on the pineal gland, and that's how you remember things.
So it's like carving channels in the brain with the flow of animal spirits. Pretty ingenious, even if the details are a bit off. And how did this mechanical body move?
He had two ways. One, movements caused directly by the pineal gland itself, either because of this force of the soul, although he didn't focus on that in the treatise, or because the spirits swirled around randomly, or because sensory input triggered a flow of spirits. And two, reflexes, where the spirits just exchanged directly between the brain hemispheres bypassing the pineal gland. But when the pineal gland did move, it would open and close those tiny valves in the ventricles, sending spirits through specific nerves to make muscles contract or relax. And again, he used the word idea to describe the particular pattern of spirit flow that made you move.
It's a really complex system he built, even if based on some wrong ideas. Now, between the treatise and his later book, The Passions of the Soul, did his thinking about the pineal gland change?
Yes, definitely. We see him refining his ideas in his Dioptrics, published in 1637. There, he specifically says the pineal gland is the seat of the sensus communis, this idea from Aristotle, about a central faculty that integrates all your senses into one coherent perception. Interestingly, in Dioptrics, he also tackles the problem of how we see. He tries to avoid the homuncular fallacy, the idea that there's a tiny person inside your brain looking at the image on your retina.
Oh, right. Like who's watching the watcher? That gets tricky.
Totally. Descartes argues that it's not the image itself that the soul sees, but the movements creating that image in the brain, the patterns of animal spirits.
Clever way to get around that problem.
Right. And in letters from 1640 and 1641, he confirms that the small gland he talked about earlier is definitely the pineal gland, or canera inferior. But more importantly, he starts to explain why he thinks it's the main spot for the rational soul, the thing that makes us humans special. His main point, and it makes sense philosophically, is its singularity. Unlike most parts of the brain, there's only one pineal gland.
Yeah, that makes sense. One gland for one mind.
Exactly. He thought, if we experience the world as one unified thing, we see one world with two eyes, hear one sound with two ears, and usually have one thought at a time, there must be one place in the brain where all this comes together and interacts with the soul. And he couldn't find any other single structure that fit the bill.
The singularity argument, I can see why that was appealing.
He also liked other things about the pineal gland. He thought its location was perfect, right in the middle of the brain's cavities, surrounded by branches of the carotid arteries, which, again, he wrongly thought carried the animal spirits. He also liked that it was small, light, and he thought it could move easily. He compared it to other single structures, like the pituitary gland, which he thought was immobile and outside the main part of the brain, and the processus vermiformis of the cerebellum, which he mistakenly believed could be divided.
So it wasn't just that it was unique, but also its location and physical features that made it special for him.
Absolutely. And in these later writings, he expands on his ideas about memory. In the treatise, he focused on the brain hemispheres, but now he suggests that memories could be stored in different parts of the brain, even in the pineal gland and in the muscles. He also introduces the idea of a purely intellectual memory, existing only in the soul. And it's interesting that some of his contemporaries, like Jean Cousin and Henricus Regius, supported his idea about the pineal gland being the seat of the sensus communis, showing that his ideas, even with some anatomical mistakes, were sparking a lot of debate.
So his ideas were a bit like a catalyst for exploring the mind-body problem, even if they weren't perfect. Now, onto The Passions of the Soul, his last major work. How does the pineal gland play a role there?
The Passions of the Soul is kind of like a continuation of the treatise, but with a different starting point. Instead of a purely mechanical body, he starts with the human as a whole, a union of body and soul. And he has a way to distinguish what belongs to each. If something can exist in a non-living thing, it's part of the body. But if you can't imagine it without a mind, it's part of the soul. Thinking, for example, is clearly a soul thing.
Okay, so a clear division between physical and mental. But then, how does the pineal gland, a physical thing, fit into this?
He brings it back, but just before that, he makes a big point. The soul is connected to the whole body, not just one part. He compares it to the body itself, where injuring one part affects the whole thing. And he emphasizes that the soul is indivisible and doesn't relate to physical space in the same way the body does. He's drawing on ideas from thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas.
But that seems to contradict the idea of the pineal gland being the main spot for the soul.
It does. But he uses a clever analogy to bridge the gap. He compares the mind to gravity. The force of gravity exists throughout an object, but its effect can be focused on one point, like if you hang the object from a rope. Similarly, he argues the mind is everywhere in the body, but acts most directly through the pineal gland. It's also important to note that, unlike some later interpretations, Descartes did believe the soul had a kind of spatial presence in the body, even though that wasn't its main feature.
That's an important distinction. So, in The Passions of the Soul, what exactly does the pineal gland do?
He basically revisits ideas from the treatise and his letters, but with more detail. He says the pineal gland is in those cavities filled with animal spirits, and it can be moved both by those spirits, which come from the body and senses, and by the soul's will. This movement, in turn, directs the flow of spirits, controlling how the limbs move. He gives a vivid description of how we remember things. He says the soul can tilt the pineal gland to direct spirits to specific parts of the brain where traces of past experiences are stored, kind of like opening up specific pathways. This flow then creates a movement in the gland that represents the remembered thing to the soul. He also talks about how the soul can directly control actions. Simply by wanting to do something, the pineal gland moves in the right way, sending spirits to the right muscles.
It's a whole system for explaining how the mind, through this gland, controls the body. What about emotions? How do they fit in?
He believed that emotions were caused by the pineal gland being agitated by the flow of animal spirits, which were themselves stirred up by what was happening in the body and the senses. He even talks about how the soul and the animal spirits could push the gland in opposite directions, leading to internal conflict, like when you want to do two things at once.
So, a kind of battleground in the pineal gland between your rational will and your bodily urges. It's fascinating, even though it was all speculation. But this idea of a non-physical soul controlling a physical gland caused problems later, right?
Oh yeah, big problems. Later thinkers, struggling with Descartes' dualism, pointed out that a non-physical will moving a physical object like the pineal gland would violate basic laws of physics, like the conservation of energy.
Mm.
Of course, Descartes didn't know about this law, but it's interesting that in his Principles of Philosophy, his wording of the third law of motion is a bit vague, as if he sensed there might be more to it than just physical forces.
Like he knew there was something he couldn't quite explain. Now, looking back, it seems like there's so many interpretations of his ideas about the mind and body. Was he a dualist or was it more complicated than that?
It's really complex. He never laid out a final, complete theory about the soul and its connection to the body. This has led to a ton of different interpretations. Some people think he was a hylomorphist, like Aristotle, with the soul being the form of the body. Others see him as more of a Platonist, emphasizing the soul's superiority. Some even argue for trialism, where body, mind, and their union are three separate categories. The most common view is interactionism, that the mind and body directly influence each other. But you also have parallelism, where they're synchronized without direct influence, different types of non-parallelism, occasionalism, where God is the middleman, epiphenomenalism, where the body affects the mind but not the other way around, supervenientism, where mental states depend on physical states, dual aspect identity theory, where mind and body are two sides of the same coin, and even some who see hints of skeptical idealism or covert materialism in his work.
Wow, it's amazing how many different ways people have read Descartes.
Yeah, and it shows how rich his work is. It's even been argued that you could connect his ideas through certain interpretation of Aristotle's view of the soul to things like behaviorism and functionalism, which are more focused on outward behavior and function rather than inner experience. It's like his work foreshadowed a lot of later thinking about the mind. It's worth noting that Descartes himself, later in life, realized his project was incomplete and even advised people to focus on physical studies for practical benefits rather than getting lost in metaphysical speculation.
So he was aware of the limits of his own thinking. Now, what happened to his pineal gland theory after he died? Did it become the accepted view?
Not at all. Most people rejected his specific ideas about the pineal gland, even during his lifetime and definitely after his death as science progressed. Thomas Willis, a big name in neuroscience back then, argued that animals, which Descartes didn't think had a rational soul, still had a pineal gland. That kind of threw a wrench in the whole seat of the soul thing.
A pretty strong argument against his theory.
Definitely. And Niels Stenson, also known as Steno, another great anatomist, pointed out all the mistakes Descartes made about the pineal gland's location and its connection to blood vessels. He also stressed how little we really knew about the brain back then and said we needed more observation and less speculation. There was a guy named Petrus Camper in the 18th century who seemed to support Descartes, but it's not clear how serious he was about the whole pineal gland thing. Philosophically, the idea that the mind and body could directly interact to the pineal gland, what they called Cartesian interactionism, was often ridiculed because people couldn't understand how two completely different things, mind and matter, could actually influence each other.
So his attempt to solve the mind-body problem actually created more problems.
Right. And even his singularity argument lost its appeal as we learned more about the brain. Giulio Cesare Lancisi, an Italian doctor, thought the corpus callosum, the big bundle of fibers connecting the two hemispheres, was the seat of the soul, because it was also a single structure. But then experiments like Gottfried Zinn's work on dogs with split brains showed that this wasn't true. And Enlightenment thinkers like Lemaitre directly challenged the idea that you needed a single physical location for the soul to explain the unity of conscious experience.
So both science and philosophy moved on from Descartes' pineal gland theory. But what about the scientific understanding of the gland itself? Did that change after his ideas were rejected?
Well, for a while, progress was slow. It's surprising that in 1828, Francois Magendie, a famous physiologist, actually went back to the old idea from Galen that the pineal gland was a valve controlling fluid flow. Shows you how long old ideas can stick around.
Yeah, sometimes it takes a while to shake things up.
But then, towards the end of the 19th century, things started changing. A bunch of scientists, working independently, proposed that the pineal gland might be a leftover from an ancient third eye on the top of the head, like what some reptiles have. This idea, with some modifications, is still around today. At the same time, people started thinking that the pineal gland wasn't just a useless leftover, but actually produced hormones. This turned out to be true, and in the 20th century, Aaron Lerner and his team discovered melatonin in 1958, a hormone produced by the pineal gland that regulates our sleep-wake cycles.
So the gland Descartes thought was the center of reason is actually controlling our body clock. That's a pretty big shift in our understanding.
Huge. And the discovery of melatonin even led to it being a popular health supplement in the 1990s. This did spark some new philosophical discussions about consciousness in the brain, but nothing major. But outside of mainstream science, the pineal gland got picked up by some, let's say, less scientific groups.
You mean all those new age ideas about the third eye?
Exactly. In the late 19th century, Helena Blavatsky, who started Theosophy, connected the anatomical third eye to mystical traditions like the Eye of Shiva in Hinduism. She said the pineal gland in humans was a leftover from a spiritual organ that could access higher realms of consciousness. And even though there's no scientific evidence for this, these ideas are still popular today.
So the pineal gland went from being the seat of reason to a body clock regulator, and now it's a spiritual antenna for some. Quite a journey.
It is. And while Descartes wasn't the first or last person to talk about the pineal gland, he definitely gave it more philosophical weight than anyone before him. His attempt to explain everything about the mind through this tiny gland, even though it was wrong in many ways, is a really important part of our history of trying to understand the mind-body problem. Even today, with a whole journal dedicated to it, the Journal of Pineal Research, the pineal gland is still fascinating to scientists.
So for you, our listener, we've taken you on a deep dive through history, from ancient ideas about the brain to Descartes' intricate but ultimately flawed theory about the pineal gland as the center of the soul and thought. We explored how science and philosophy challenged his ideas and how our understanding of the pineal gland's real function evolved from a mystical organ to a key player in our sleep cycles, and how it still holds a certain mystique even today.
And for someone who loves to learn quickly and thoroughly, like you, this exploration of Descartes' theory, even in its inaccuracies, gives you a great shortcut to understanding the long history of how humans have tried to figure out what consciousness is and how the brain works. We hope you've had some aha moments along the way, seeing how ideas change and develop over time.
Now, for a final thought to chew on, something for a true philosopher king. We've come so far in understanding the brain since Descartes, with all the technology we have now, but the big question of what consciousness is still a mystery. What would a future king philosopher, armed with all of today's knowledge, say about the seat of thought? And even more interesting, how will their ideas be seen by future generations? It's a reminder that our quest to understand the mind is never ending, each generation building on what came before, both the successes and the mistakes.